Hello, welcome to Varnblog Solo. And we are talking about getting the terms right, Imperialism, Part 4. Now, in Part 1, I went through the general early history of the term imperialism up to about Lenin. Its early usage, which meant something completely different. The shift in usage after the British liberal J. Hobson changed the meaning of the term to talk about the lead up to World War One. The initial architecture of finance capital as developed by Hilferding, Bukharin's theories. I mentioned Rosa Luxemburg's theories offhand, and Kolakowski's theories of ultra or super imperialism. Now, we then had an episode on Hilferding in detail around finance capital and what that did as a development in Marxist historiography. Then I went into Kautsky's ultra or super imperialism theory, which is actually very kind of under theorized. It's, a couple articles and some things he worked out later. And now we're going to talk about Rosa Luxemburg, 1913 work, The Accumulation of Capital, which is a development of Marx's primitive accumulation so-called thesis that she did that is also a pretty major work on imperialism. And one thing I'm going to point out is when I initially read this, I didn't pick up that it was theoretically different than Lenin. When I was reading this in my early 30s, I assumed that roughly the same mechanisms worked. But if you look at the details, and this is where I start really pointing stuff out, Luxemburg's assumptions are actually pretty common on a lot of the Marxist left, but they are not compatible with Lenin's assumptions. And it's not obvious to a lot of people. So let's start off with a little capsule biography of Rosa Luxemburg. I haven't done this for everybody. Maybe I should have done one for Kautsky too, but I feel like I talk about him enough that you guys should know him. And Luxemburg's famous and claimed by everyone. Luxemburg was born in 1871. She died in 1919. She was a leading theorist of the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD. She was Polish, but naturalized in Germany. And she later founded the Spartacus Bund, which evolved into the KPD, or the Communist Party of Germany. The Spartacus Bund was one of the two anti-war factions that broke off of the SPD, the other one being the Independent Social Democratic Party, or the USPD, which was the party of Bernstein and Kautsky, that was established from 1917 until they reincorporated mostly into the SPD. For the most part, by the early 1920s, although I think it technically existed as an organization until 1931, when it formally and completely emerged with the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the SAPD. So that's a lot of German acronyms for you to remember. She was born and raised in Poland to a secular Jewish family. She was active in the Revolutionary Youth Leagues. She co-founded the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland in Lithuania, the SDKPIL, a party that rejected Polish nationalism in favor of international class struggle, which is going to come up a lot. After moving to Germany in 1898, she became the most famous voice of the SPD's revolutionary wing. Some might call it its left or even maybe ultra-left wing. Her 1900 pamphlet, Social Reform or Revolution, she defended revolution against Bernstein. And this is really what most people read by her today. She was inspired by the 1905 Russian Revolution to develop a theory of the mass strike, which she saw as the proletariat's most important revolutionary tool. and she is often noted for emphasizing spontaneity and the creativity of the working class. Luxembourg was an anti-militarist and an anti-imperialist very clearly, and particularly as World War I approached. And in 1913, she wrote The Accumulation of Capital. We're going to get to that in a minute. She fiercely condemned the party's support for the war and was imprisoned for most of the conflict. From prison, she wrote the influential Junius pamphlet, which declared a war a betrayal of the working class and popularized the phrase socialism or barbarism, which itself is probably a reworking of the classic phrase socialism or the common ruin. While she celebrated the Russian Revolution in 1917, she did have critiques of the Bolsheviks' policies. And depending on who you are and what you want to leave Luxembourg for, you will either, read her support of Lenin in those pamphlets as undoing her support for our critiques of the democratic curtailments in the periods of war communism, but she was kind of used in a variety of ways after her death. She was released from prison during the German Revolution of 1918-1919, where she co-founded what would become the KPD. There's a Spartacus uprising in Berlin, which was crushed by the Freikorps. Luxembourg and Karl Liebknecht, Wilhelm Liebknecht's son, just said that because I used to get those two confused, were captured and then murdered. So she has the status of a martyr. Another thing to remember about the Spartacus Bund is that they were formed by Liebknecht, Luxembourg, and Clara Zetkin, someone who's often associated with the center right of the SPD, but plays a clear role in the founding of the Spartacus Bund. They were councilist. They were a big supporter of the Council Republic, obviously in Germany, which was part of the November Revolution, which was ultimately put down. And they ultimately become one of the bases for the German Communist Party. Although they did have an affiliation with the USPD, the Independent Social Democrats, and often basically worked in coalition with them to deal with the war. So let's talk about what's actually in the accumulation of capital, because I'm not just going to point out that the theory is different from Lenin's. It also has implications that kind of ripple through Marxism and a lot of the key Marxist debates that we still have: underconsumption or overaccumulation, monopoly capital or expansion of markets, is dumping goods or extraction the primary mode of imperialism, or some mixture of the two? These are the questions that plague inter-Marxist debates on imperialism today that most people don't pick up the subtleties on. Basically, imperialism bad because it is bad, but the mechanism of imperialism aren't agreed upon, and this really does matter. So, Luxembourg's theory of imperialism, which was detailed in the work that I just mentioned, The Accumulation of Capital, departs from Marxist theories by focusing on the mathematical necessary of expansion to offset the declining rates of profits. She argues that capitalism cannot survive in a closed system, which I agree with her, actually. It must constantly consume non-capitalist environments or open up new markets to realize surplus value. So far, I'm totally with Luxembourg on this. This is a fundamental problem of capitalism, and something that I think Lenin would not have totally opposed, but we'll get to where there is a conflict. So Luxembourg's starting point was a critique of Marxist production schemas and volume 2 of Capital. She argues that in a pure capitalist society consisting only of workers and capitalists, there's a structural problem with realizing profits. Right? So at the time that Marx was writing, there was no pure capitalist society. I would argue there is still no pure capitalist society, a society where there is only workers and capitalists, although we're closer to it today than we used to be. But we'll get into that. The gap, workers are paid less than the value they produce. Capitalists cannot consume the entire remaining surplus, so they must reinvest it in order to compete. If neither the workers nor the capitalists can buy back the total product, who provides an effective demand for the surplus? How are you going to generate more surplus when neither side can buy back enough? The answer is an external non-capitalist strata, peasants, artisans, colonies, people either excluded from capital and transition to capital are excluded from capital by geography. Therefore, capitalism necessarily must have an outside at all times. For Luxembourg, imperialism is a political expression of the process of capital accumulation as it battles what remains of the non-capitalist world. And this takes form in 3 places. The commodity market selling finished goods to non-capitalist societies. And this is where she would have agreed with Lenin. But resource extraction, forcing these societies to provide raw materials. So not through commodity exploitation or the exploitation of the market, but through direct expropriation. And 3, breaking the labor side down, breaking down traditional communal feudal structures to create free labor forces that aren't there. And I think you can see this in Rhodesia and South Africa, for example. They had to force hunter-gatherers into proletarian relations because, frankly, the hunter-gathering was effective enough that they didn't need to move into the cities in the same way subsistence peasants did in Europe. To expand on this, there's a role of militarism and loans. International loans are part of the problem for Luxembourg as for everyone. Capitalist states lend money to non-capitalists or developing nations. Non-capitalists, such as the Ottoman Empire, are developing, such as Egypt, at the time that she was writing. The money is then used to buy industrial goods from the lending nations, forcing an outside into the capitalist debt cycle. So you have someone outside of the capitalist circuit to bring money in so that the surplus is valorized and realized. Militarism is also part of this, but this isn't just a byproduct of national rivalry. It's part of the providence of accumulation. Taxes are taken from the working class that are funneled into arms production, creating a guaranteed market for heavy industry, and the state becomes a consumer on the market. Again, I don't have a problem with this. But this leads to a kind of paradox. Capitalism requires non-capitalist environments to survive, but its very nature is to transform these environments into capitalist ones by subjugating them. Once the entire world is fully capitalized, there is no outsides left to exploit. Thus, the realization of surplus value becomes impossible. In Luxembourg's view, this will lead to an automatic economic collapse of the system, though she argued that the resulting social crises and wars could trigger a proletarian revolution long before this mathematical limit was reached. Now, if this sounds a little bit like Grossman, it does, but they disagree on the mechanism, and we can get into that. Grossman being Henryk Grossman, another Polish Marxist associated with the early Frankfurt School. And by early, I don't mean Horkheimer and Adorno. I mean around Grun and the Austro-Marxist who were associated with the Frankfurt School when it was first opened in Germany before it migrated to the US. All right. While Lenin saw imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism driven by monopoly finance and capital, Luxembourg saw it as a permanent necessity of capital accumulation at all times, and that's there from the very beginning of capitalism. Now, if this sounds Maoist to you, it's because it kind of is. Now, a lot of Maoists think that they are Leninist, and they are, but actually a whole lot of the people in like the uneven development camp and the Gunther Frank School of underdevelopment actually pull a lot more from Luxembourg than they do from Lenin, even if they refer to Lenin more. So one of the differences, Lenin's view of monopoly and finance capital meant that imperialism was a return to a form that was new, and it was different from primitive accumulation, so-called, in capital. Whereas Luxembourg sees this as like an ever-present part of capitalism. It's got to exist because it's the only way to make the circuit of capital work. Now, you will notice, though, she's critiquing Marx on this. And this is part of the issue why a lot of very, very orthodox Marxists reject it. There's maybe some empirical stuff we'll get into, too. All right. Now, to understand this, and it doesn't necessarily say that this is about underconsumption, but the underconsumption, overproduction debates are part of the issue here. If you agree with Lenin, you believe that overproduction is the issue and that monopoly and finance capital are trying to handle overproduction by national boundaries. If you agree with Luxembourg, you think this is a permanent part of capitalism and that this is an issue of consumption not being able to keep up and valorize surplus. Now, if you take nationally bounded views of consumption, you could come to the conclusion, like John Hobson did in his Imperialism, and then later Chartist and Keynesians and modern monetary theorists did, that actually if you can generate enough domestic consumption, you can keep profits high. It's basically a Fordist model. And that is one of the things at stake in the underconsumptionist debate. Luxembourg's math would indicate this is possible, but completely unlikely for power relations reasons. And we can get into that. Now, there's a lot of criticisms of this underconsumptionist assumption in Luxembourg's accumulation of capital. So there's basically three. I'm not going to talk about them all, but I'll get into it. There's Hendrik Groman's law of accumulation and the breakdown of the capitalist system, which is probably the most famous Marxist internal critique of Luxembourg. Grossman argues that the limit of capital is not a lack of outside markets under consumption, because that would also imply you can fix it by increasing consumption internal to capitalism, which he accused Luxembourg of not thinking of, but the fall of rates of profits itself, and thus the overaccumulation of capital. And this would be consistent with Lenin's view, even though it's not exactly the same mechanism Lenin was talking about. Then there's Nikolai Bukharin's Imperialism and the Accumulation of Capital. Now, you will note that there's this focus on accumulation of capital in these early works and not just imperialism, because it ties it to the parts of Marx that is relevant to the discussion. And remember, Marx did write about imperialism, but by imperialism, he meant the governments of the Bonapartes and the French state, not primitive accumulation, so-called. Whereas by responding to Hobson and tying in finance capital, Bukharin and Lenin in particular are picking up on this accumulation issue, tying it to the tendency of capital to monopolize and their centralization thesis, and looking at these contradictions and explaining imperialism as the answer to the contradiction. It's just a terrible answer. Now, Bukharin's isn't exactly the same as Lenin's, and I'll do that in episode 5 of this, where I talk about Bukharin's theories. And don't worry, we're not stopping with Lenin. I just might actually stop for a little while, take a break, and cover some other topics, and then come back, because I need to get to modern theories of imperialism, or at least mid-century theories of imperialism. But anyway, so Bukharin offers another systemic rebuttal of Luxembourg, arguing that Luxembourg misunderstood Marx's Volume 2 schemas. He contends that the expanded production is possible in a closed system, provided the proportions between the means of production and the means of consumption are maintained. So, that's a far more technical argument, but basically, Bukharin argues that a closed system is possible. Now, I'm not going to say that even though Bukharin is related to the left, he is the author of the idea of socialism in one country, that maybe this is consistent with his work of imperialism, but maybe it's consistent with his work of imperialism because they are related. I'm not going to get into the day. I'll get into that on the episode on Bukharin. And then there's one more critique of Luxembourg, which is Anton Pannekoek's critique, the theory of the class of capitalism from 1934, where he says that capitalism is not a machine that just runs out of fuel, and this is a problem. Now, there are some modern critiques of Luxembourg. Paul Maddox Sr. an economic crisis, and crisis theory really emphasizes the problem, but Matic is developing and picking up theories by Grossman. The Aufhebung Collective also critiqued Luxembourg-esque theories for their objectivism and automaticity to the fall of capitalism. And then there's people like Roman Rostulski, who specifically had chapters in The Making of Marx's Capital in a book he wrote in 1968 that defends Marx against Luxembourg's corrections and saying that Luxembourg misunderstood the claim. Now, I'm going to go into kind of the two contrasted here. We're going to focus on the difference between Lenin and Luxembourg. Now, I know by the time we actually get to episode 6 in this series, which is Lenin's, you guys are going to be tired of this because I've actually had to refer to Lenin so much, even though his work is basically the last of these classic texts, and it's a very short text. It's one I've read all online before. I've done line by line analysis of it. But let's talk about this. Luxembourg basically has a vacuum theory. Luxembourg argues that capitalism is inherently unable to survive on its own. There's a problem of underconsumption, that the workers and capitalists with a closed system could never buy back all the goods produced. This creates a surplus that cannot be realized as profit. Now, this sounds like overproduction, but it's not. What the issue is you can get rid of the surplus by having other people consume it from the outside, and by giving them loans, let's tie them into the capitalist system, forcing them to undergo a proletarization process. So while you're both extracting and developing these nations into the capitalist system, you're also suppressing and underdeveloping them simultaneously to maintain an outside to the system so capitalist surplus profits can be valorized. Bukharin and Lenin would both say, well, that's just not true. You can do that within the system itself, and particularly if you add things like rents and whatnot, we can see it being done. All right. That means that to survive, capitalism must constantly expand in a non-capitalist area, like agricultural colonies or pre-capitalist societies or other forms of tributary empires, et cetera, et cetera. They need that to find new consumers to constantly valorize that remaining bit of profit that can't be consumed within the system. Luxembourg argued that once the entire world becomes capitalist and there's no more outsiders left to exploit, the system will face an inevitable mechanical collapse. And then the question is, socialism or barbarism? Because there's nowhere else to go. And you can see this playing into her theories about World War I. This is actually remarkably consistent with what she argued later on about relations to the war. Now, Lenin's more of a monopoly finance capitalist. Monopoly and finance have subsumed free competition because free competition has two problems. One, the more effective capital firms will just buy up the smaller ones, and two, there are lesser and lesser profits, so monopolies can manage the lack of profits. And this leads to a merger of banks and industrial capital because finance can make up the difference between valorizable profits and profits needed now. Which means while Luxembourg focuses on exporting goods and then extraction, so you export goods to force loans force extraction of goods back into the system, Lenin focuses on the export of capital. So you literally force a capitalist system to be done at gunpoint in these other countries. And they do this to sell their goods to get rid of their overproduction. Very similar, but they're not valorizing the profit here. They are actually deliberately underdeveloping these nations so that they can get more profits or higher profits through cheap labor and resources, which cannot get domestically. Again, this sounds like Luxembourg, but remember, the issue here is the inability of anyone to get the goods, because Lenin thinks that actually capitalist systems can work within one nation. Lenin seems to think that there's a business cycle, and the business cycle creates more and more efficient monopolies, whereas Luxembourg seems to think that there is just a need to valorize surplus profits. Luxembourg also views one of the main sins of imperialism as, getting people to do extraction through loans that also then tie them into the capitalist system, but that there's a natural limit to this. Lenin thinks there is no natural limit to this but war. All right. He viewed imperialism as a stage where the great powers have finishing parceling out the grove, thus leading to inevitable world wars as they redivide territory amongst themselves. So some key features to just look at. In Rosa Luxemburg's theory, the primary driver is the need to find new markets to realize surplus value. In Lenin's theory, it's the dominance of monopolies and the need to export capital itself to deal with a crisis of production. Both have similar offsets, though, and the thing is, but if either theory was true, the results look identical. It's what the final results are going to be. For Lenin, it's a war that could get rid of enough overproduction and restart the capital cycle. For Luxembourg, this is inevitable because it's always part of capitalism, and that when this is done, capitalism will fail, but you would want a revolution before that point. All right. The role of colonies. They're a sink from unsold goods from their home country and a source of extraction. So you sell cheap goods there, but you also extract raw resources. For Lenin, the role of colonies is a high return investment and also resource extraction, but through investment. So again, they're very similar, but the mechanism is different enough that it creates all kinds of controversies. Sustainability is really where this is different. The sustainability is not possible for Luxembourg because eventually you're going to run out of non-capitalist spaces. For Lenin, capitalism can persist through parasitism and war until it is overthrown by revolution, meaning wars can destroy enough to reset the process, and thus there is no natural end to capitalism because there are offsets. If you look at the focus here, you can see that Luxembourg might be accused of being economistic and mathematical, whereas Lenin might be accused of being voluntaristic, but also structural, in that he thinks this is about institutions and political evolution running into economic necessities, but really it's political answers to them. Whereas Luxembourg, the political is almost not even all that important to the imperialist process. Now, this has some more implications. Luxembourg, like I said, suggests that capitalism will eventually choke out. Lenin argues that it will become a bloated and aggressive rentier state that requires violent political shoves to end, but that the violence inherent to itself can actually basically form not so creative destruction that can get rid of the surplus goods and restart the capitalist cycle. Luxembourg basically implies that if you wait long enough, you will have conditions to win, but you don't want to wait that long because it will lead to the common ruin of the world. This also would imply differences in national self-determination, which is one of the major rifts in Marx's history. While Lenin famously sided with Luxembourg and Pannekoek on the state against Kautsky, believe it or not, people should read State and Revolution for this, including a lot of Marxists today. Lenin decided against them on their distrust of nationalism and national liberation. There are basically 3 to 4 views of national liberation. I'm actually going to cover this on a different segment one day. It's one of the biggest debates in Marxism. It still plagues us to this day, and it's tied into imperialism naturally. And when I talk about third worldism and all that, it's going to still be tied into that too. But the arguments are basically the Otto Bauer, you should have an international proletariat but nationally recognized subcommittees, so cultural nationalism is acceptable but political nationalism is not. There's the Lenin and Stalin, although Lenin and Stalin's variants on this aren't exactly the same. I can go into the nitty-gritty of the differences. Even though Stalin would sometimes disagree with Lenin, he'd still do Lenin's policy suggestions in honor of the man. But that national liberation was necessary because it broke down these capitalist multinational states and allowed for coherent blocs to emerge. And they also somewhat thought capitalism was possible within one country. Lenin goes back and forth on if socialism is possible within one country. If you read him from 1912 to 1918, he kind of goes all over the place, which is why when there are debates in the Comintern between Trotsky and Kamenev and Zinoviev versus Bukharin and Stalin and a few other people. They both had Lenin quotes legitimately to pull from. Now, only one really had Marx quotes, but you can read Eric Van Rie's paper on socialism in one country for that history if you'd like. All right. I think you can find that for free on the internet. But nonetheless, we need to look at the differences between Luxembourg and Lenin on national liberation because I actually do think it is applicable here. Lenin argued that communists should support the right of oppressed nations like Poland or Ukraine or Guyana to succeed and form their own states. Lenin believed that nationalist movements in the colonies of oppressed regions could weaken the great powers like the Russian or Austro-Hungarian empires, the British Empire being the biggest one. And by supporting independence, he hoped to break the chain of imperialism and weaken its links. He also argued that if the Russian proletariat supported the independence of the nations Russia had oppressed in its imperial phase, it would prove that they weren't just great Russian chauvinists, eventually making a voluntary socialist federation possible and viable. Now, they actually went so far as to create the conditions for certain groups to be considered nationals, like find languages so they met all the criterion that Stalin and Lenin and the people in the Comintern had come up with as a criterion for nations. Luxembourg rejects this. Luxembourg fiercely opposed the right of national determination because she saw it as a bourgeois trap. After all, the workers of the world have no country. And again, like I said, with everyone in the debates in the Comintern and in the USSR in the 1920s about socialism in one country, having Lenin to pull from, both sides could quote the Communist Manifesto on this, which talks about the workers of the world organizing in their national context and coming together internationally. But also saying that the proletariat has no country. In the national question, she argued, in her text on the national question, she argued that modern capitalism made small nations economically unviable, which I actually do see some evidence for. Independence, she argued, would only result in small nations becoming a puppet state of larger imperialist powers, so why do it? I gotta admit, I'm an auto-Barrian in all this, but I actually do kind of find Luxembourg's predictions here to be a little bit uncomfortable because it does kind of happen. She also feared that nationalism would divide the international working class. A Polish worker has everything in common with a German worker for her and nothing in common with the Polish capitalist, just like Marx had argued about the tensions between the Irish and the English, where there are real stakes between the English and the Irish, but whether you're a closed borderist or a free trader, ultimately those are manipulated by different factions of the local English bourgeoisie, and thus siding with the Irish would actually help the English. Siding with the Irish working class would actually help the English. I'm going to be very clear here. She also called the right to self-determination parlor chatting and empty phraseology, saying it distracted from the only real struggles, which was class struggles. The reason why she did this is because how could you figure out what was a legitimate nation and what wasn't when there were such many small historical national groups that you could call nations? I mean, you can see, like, when it comes to nationalism, how the USSR handled its own indigenous people in Siberia, to see that, like, sometimes they created nations for them and sometimes they just didn't want to deal with it. So we can look at this as an irony in history because, and kind of in retrospect, in the end of the 20th century, parts of Lenin and Luxembourg both look right to me. Lenin's strategy helped the Bolsheviks consolidate power by gaining support from non-Russian minorities. However, Luxembourg's warning that these new nations would just become capitalist pawns or buffer states proved remarkably present during the Cold War and the subsequent collapse of the Eastern Bloc, when, like, I don't know, playing the Baltic states off of a fear of a new Russian empire could get them sucked into NATO and Western capitalist powers and blah, 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 blah. It is interesting that the Polish question was really a big dividing point for them, and Luxembourg, being Polish herself, thought that Polish independence was romantic and kind of a bourgeois utopian fantasy that would only strengthen the Polish bourgeoisie. And for Lenin, it was a practical necessity to break up the greater empires, particularly the Russian Empire, of which the Poles had been subjected. Luxembourg even went so far as to argue that Poland had been organically incorporated into the Russian Empire through her views of accumulation, that the industrial linkage, that the social democracy of the King of Poland and Lithuania had refused this, and that her rejection of the social patriot was all part of this. Now, Lenin argued that Russian socialists didn't demand the right for Poland to leave. They were effectively acting as police for the Tsar, and thus they were being chauvinistic. He compared the right to secede to the right to divorce, and that tactical unity meant that by granting the right to secede, you could neutralize defensive nationalism of the Polish workers, making them more likely to trust Russian revolutionaries because, after all, they'd helped them gain independence. Unfortunately, history doesn't validate any one of those views. See what happened in Poland in the 1930s for that. Another issue that you can kind of look at is some stuff that comes out of the accumulation of capital that a lot of people wish to critique. Grossman also attempted to do a direct mathematical attack on Luxembourg's rewriting of our review of the schemas in Capital Volume 2. In fact, he used the same production schemas but came to a different conclusion. He argued that this isn't a realization problem of selling goods, but a profitability problem of what you can claim from the amount of goods you sell. So you can still sell goods, but the profits go down. This isn't really the same thing. It looks like it's the same thing, but it's not. And the difference between the two is somewhat technical. Some of this has to do with the organic composition of capitalism. Capitalists spend more and more money on machinery and less on labor. But since only labor creates surplus value, the pool of profit shrinks relative to the massive amount of capital already invested because competition drives prices down while the cost of machinery stays steady or goes up. Thus, eventually, this leads to the same kind of breakdown of capitalism that Luxembourg predicted, but for a completely different reason. Instead of it being because capitalism has conquered a globe and no longer has an outside to deal with a surplus, what you have here is the amount of surplus value produced isn't enough to fund the next round of investments eventually, and these have jams because it can no longer expand. So they're both about the expansion of capital, but overaccumulation drives this, and this would happen in a coherent closed system or an open system. Now, Grossman actually also, unlike Luxembourg, does see that there's counter tendencies that come up that can make capital work. He talks about some of them, such as increased productivity or speeding up work, cutting wages, pressing down, variable capital costs, cutting wages basically, or inflating. That's another one you can do. Or most importantly, imperialism and war. But imperialism isn't about finding new buyers. It's about cheaper raw materials and labor to sell to restore profit. So believe it or not, in Grossman, you have a slightly different view of imperialism than you do in Lenin or in Bukharin or in Hilferding or in whomever. But it's a little bit closer to the one you see in Bukharin and Lenin than the one you see in Luxembourg. Paul Maddox took this further, arguing against both Luxembourg and Keynes. He argued that consumption is a result of accumulation, not the driver of it. If profit rates are high, capitalists will invest, which create jobs and demand. If profit rates are low, there are no new amount of markets or government spending can save the system. So this means that both imperialist expansion for markets and not for capital, and internal government spending to stimulate consumption within the working class and make up the gap won't fix it. And in many ways, believe it or not, even though she would have never taken it in this direction, Luxembourg thus becomes a predecessor of Keynes and Keynesianism. Maddox and Grossman together kind of level 3 critiques of Luxembourg. 1, they proved that mathematically that expanded reproduction is possible in a closed system because the capital system is not truly ever closed. You don't need an outside to realize profit. You just need the right proportions between the industries. You also see this in Bukharin. You see this in Lenin. This is basically the argument is that it's not a matter of the enclosed system. This isn't a matter of just entropy. Although I kind of do think that they're being a little bit optimistic about that. 2, by focusing on on the outside, Luxembourg misses the internal logic of capital itself. If the problem is outside, then capitalism is perfected internally and only fails when it runs out of space, which means it can fix its profit problems by imperialism. Grossman argues that the failure is both internal and inevitable, regardless of any geographic expansion. Geographic expansion may be a countervailing tendency, but it's not going to remove the tendency overall. Now, Grossman, unlike thus Lenin, thinks that the failure of capital is inevitable, but for completely different reasons. And for Grossman, Maddox, and Lenin, and Bukharin, imperialism is a search for higher rates of profits, not a research for ways to valorize profits overall. So you can valorize profits in the sense, but if you want a higher rate, you would lever imperialism to do it. And that's where we're going to end this today. We will get into this in the future more in depth when I talk about some more of the schemas that are implied by this. And believe it or not, I think, and there's many ways in which like underdevelopment theory and some other post-Maoist academic theories like world system theory try to circle to square of Lenin and Luxembourg's versions of imperialism, but I'm going to get in that until a later date. This episode's already 45 minutes long. I don't want to give you any more. I hope you've learned something. I hope you realize that even when things superficially look alike, like they did to me when I first read this, there actually are subtle differences that have massive theoretical implications in other areas of Marxist theory. And Marx is somewhat ambiguous on this stuff. You can't just settle it by going to Marx himself. On that, protect your peace. I'd like to thank all my patrons. Remember, you can get access to the Patreon audio for $4, $6. We get you the couple of extra videos I do a month. And it's just me talking to my face. I'm doing a bad job of selling this. $10 will get you say in programming and votes on stuff. All of it, including a request, will get you into my Patreon. You just have to be nice to me and prove you're a person. And it's not completely open because I don't want to be sworn with bots, but we have book clubs. I do more of these kind of videos behind the paywall now. And you get audio for everything. You also get my back catalog. I have thousands and thousands of hours of content. I think I have 3,000 something posts there. I'm also using the money you give me to generate these self-study guides that I'm generating for people for study groups to form and do discussions on your own. And those are my contribution to Marxist education. I am thinking about doing some summer classes in the future for a small fee. And we'll talk about that. I don't know if I'm going to do it this year, but I'm thinking about it because I am really concerned about this Marxist education thing. And I am thinking, well, if I can do a class to explain some basic stuff to people, and do a reading group, I don't know, for like $10-15 and get 100 people to do it, that'd be totally worth it, or even less than that. But I haven't decided to do that yet. It's just something I'm floating. I don't have the time to do it during the school year. I am still a teacher. I do still have a day job. I am even a union rep, although I feel like I don't have a lot to do with that lately. So there you go. This is dissembling at the end of the show. Not dissembling, blabbering. Dissembling would imply I'm trying to mislead you. And I'm not. I'm just trying to blabber. Protect your peace. There's a lot of unpeace out there. Things seem to be getting really bad. Imperialism seems remarkably relevant. And I guess this whole idea that you could limit the imperial spheres and everyone's just going to play by a multipolar world. Well, fading hegemons don't really do that. Neither do upcoming ones. And that's why Thucydides traps exist. But it's something we're going to have to talk about. Anyway, thank you all of you for support. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Subscribe to the Patreon if you're interested. There's also the free interview podcast if you want to listen while you're doing the dishes and don't want to deal with YouTube. I'm not monetizing anything other than my Patreon. This is still unmonetized. Every now and then someone tries to tempt me and says I get more subscribers by monetizing, which is true, but would they listen? That's what I want to know. And on that note, be well and keep fighting for a better tomorrow.